I'm Laurel Ann, and these are the books that I read in October. I have 7 books to talk about today, which is a little bit more than usual, so I'm just gonna get started so that this video isn't too long because I have a tendency to talk too much. The first book I read in October was In Our Mad and Furious City by Gunaratne. This was longlisted for the Man Booker in 2018, and after reading it, I can say that I feel like it should have made the shortlist, maybe even won, because I really, really loved this. This is set on a housing estate in northwest London where a British soldier has recently been murdered in a crime that appears to have been motivated by religious extremism. And the book follows 5 different characters from 2 different generations, all of whom are either immigrants or the children of immigrants, as they navigate the days following this crime and experience the fallout from this event. So pretty much as soon as I read the first paragraph, I had a feeling that this was going to be one of my favorite books of the year, and it really did not disappoint me. The writing in this is really extraordinary. As I said, there are 5 different perspectives, and I truly have never read a book that did multiple perspectives better than this. All of the voices were so distinct. Each chapter starts with, a little subtitle that tells you which character you're hearing from, but even without that, I am 100% certain that I would have been able to tell who it was, because the voices are just that distinct and yet still really rooted in reality. They felt very real, not forced in any way just to make some kind of distinction, if that makes sense. I think that Gunaratne has a real ear for language and dialect. As I said, some of the characters are immigrants, and you can really see the influence of their home countries running through their language. I felt so much for these characters and this community. This was a really, really emotional reading experience for me, but I also think it's an incredibly important book, and I wish more people would read this because I think it's very truthful and it's very timely, and it gives us a very honest look at a London that we don't often see represented in literature. I think Gunaratne is a real talent. He himself grew up poor on a housing estate in London, and I can't wait to see what he comes out with next. The next book I read was The Book Collector by Thompson. This is a spooky kind of gothic novel about a young woman in Edwardian England who marries a very rich widower who collects books. And he collects books because he appreciates them as beautiful sort of art objects, whereas she really enjoys stories. So when she first moves into his manor, she reads a lot of the books from his library until she finds that he has a book of fairy tales in a safe that he will not allow her to touch. And in the weeks and months following the birth of her son, she becomes completely obsessed by this book of fairy tales and by the question of why her husband won't let her touch it. She also begins to learn more and more unsettling things about her husband, and it all comes to a head when she has a bit of a mental health crisis and is sent to an asylum. This book was just okay for me. I definitely had fun reading it. I sped through it in just a couple of sittings. It is quite spooky, which was what I wanted, very atmospheric, and the story was compelling. However, nothing about Thompson's writing really sparkled for me. It was just sort of okay. I did really appreciate what it had to say about the expectations of women and women's sexuality at this time, but overall it's not one that really stuck with me. I would recommend this if you're looking for something spooky, but I wouldn't say it's a must read. The next book I read was The Hoarder by Jess. This is the second book of Jess that I've read this year, and she is definitely making her way into the pantheon of my favorite authors. This is the story of a woman named Maud who is sent to be a carer for a very grumpy old man who lives in a huge mansion in London that is full to the brim of garbage, essentially. And as she helps him clear out his home, she begins to find objects that suggest that something very dark has happened in his family. And goaded along by her eccentric best friend, who is a middle-aged, agoraphobic trans woman, she begins to investigate this man's past and his family. There's also magical realism in this, so Maud can see saints. They appear to her and speak with her and sometimes protect and help her. And there also might be ghosts. So there's a lot going on here, but it really works. Jess Kidd is just a really good writer. She has a very clever understanding of the way language works, and there are some really beautiful sentences throughout her writing. I will say, with this book, I felt a little bit let down by the ending. I just think that it was a little bit more action driven than the rest of the story in a way that I just wasn't head over heels in love with. However, I still really enjoyed the process of reading this book, and I've also thought about it quite a lot since I finished it. Next, I read Pumpkinheads by Rainbow Rowell and Faith Erin Hicks. This has been making the rounds on YouTube this month, and for good reason. This is a graphic novel about a pair of kids named Deja and Josiah who work every autumn at a pumpkin patch, and they are best friends at the pumpkin patch, but they don't really speak to one another throughout the rest of the year. And they are both seniors in high school, about to go on to college, and they use their last night at the pumpkin patch to go on a sort of adventure to bond together and sort of have a last hurrah in this place that has meant so much to them throughout their teenage years. This is just a really sweet and cozy story. I loved every minute of it. I really just would love to live inside this book. I think Rainbow Rowell has a real talent for writing these small, quiet stories that are still very big and important in the lives of these characters. Nothing world-changing is going on here, but it will just make you smile, and I'm really happy that I read this October. Next, I read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This, as you probably know, is about a man who creates a man / a monster and then has to deal with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. I say you probably know what this is, but in reality, I think our cultural touch points with this story have sort of formed an idea of what happens in Frankenstein that isn't really representative of what actually happens in this book. I found the process of reading this book just really thrilling and fascinating. I really somehow felt a connection with Mary Shelley while I was reading this. I think she was an absolutely brilliant woman, and now I really want to read a biography of Mary Shelley, so if you have any recommendations for those, please let me know. I don't really know what to say about this at this point, except that if you haven't read it, you definitely should. I would love to have a discussion about this book with anybody who has read it, so hit me up if you want to get deep about Frankenstein. The next book I read in October was Asking for It by Louise O'Neill. This is about an 18-year-old girl named Emma who lives in a very small town in coastal Ireland. She is extremely beautiful and popular and kind of inconsiderate and horrible. One night she passes out at a party after taking drugs and later discovers that she was gang raped. By several prominent young men in the community. And after this event comes to light, a lot of people in the town don't believe her. They think that either she's lying about what happened or that she, you know, as the title would suggest, was asking for it. And she loses the support even of some of her close friends. Sometimes we're not even sure if everyone in her family is on her side. As you might guess, this is a really harrowing book. I found it quite triggering at parts. So, you know, big trigger warnings for this one. But I'm really glad that I pushed through because I think this is a really important book. This came out in 2015 and I remember hearing quite a lot of buzz around it at the time, but I haven't heard that much recently, but I still think it's extremely relevant, maybe even more so now than before. I think Louise O'Neill is a really incredible writer. This is the second book I've read by her. I also read Almost Love last year, and she does a really good job of writing these pretty nasty, unlikable protagonists who go through something horrible, and that sort of forces you as a reader to reconcile the things that happen to these people and the way they behave, and I don't know where I'm going with this really. I just think it's an interesting device to use when you're telling a story like this. This is one of the best YA books I have read in recent years, and I really recommend it. Already getting dark, it's 4 o'clock, like, ugh. So the last book I read in October was Hicks by Olde Heuvelt, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's just my guess based on nothing. This is a horror novel about a small town that hanged a woman for witchcraft in the mid-17th century, I believe, and has been cursed ever since. The curse basically entails that this old witch has just been wandering around the town for the last 300 years. She just will pop up in people's houses, and she hangs out for a while, and then she leaves. She doesn't really do much, but she does whisper to herself, and if you listen to what she's saying, you will want to kill yourself. You also want to kill yourself if you leave the town and spend too much time away. So basically, once you live there, you are trapped. I'm gonna be honest, this is one of the most disappointing books that I've read all year. I probably would have DNF'd it if it weren't for the fact that it was the only book that I brought with me on my little vacation. So I had to finish it, basically. I am disappointed because I really like the premise of it. It's really spooky, pretty original in my opinion, and I also think that actually the ending is pretty good, at least kind of like what the ending says about people, but the execution here just didn't do it for me. The writing is just weird, and this is translated from Dutch, and I will say that quite often with works in translation, I feel like you can tell, like, it's nothing against the translators, there are just some things that don't work, I think, but a lot of the issues I had with the writing of this book, I think, come from the original author. Like, it's just tonally very inconsistent. There are some sentences in here that are just so strange. Most of the writing is just, you know, kind of like normal, but then every so often you'll get a sentence like this. And as Griselda continued to offer up her supplication, she ate the entire rain-drenched slice of pâté. It wasn't the taste of the meat that she liked, so much as the structure of the liver, which stuck to the words on the roof of her mouth and weighed them down so they could tumble from her lips. What does that mean? It's so weird, and I can tell, like, when he wrote this, he probably was like, oh, that's so clever. And I hate when I can see through a book to the author, if that makes sense. And, like, I have nothing against this guy. We've all been there, you know, where you write something and you're just like, yes, this is brilliant. But, like, where was the editor? I'm sorry. There are also, it's written like in third person omniscient, but then there will be random passages where suddenly the third person narrator is talking about us, and like we can see, and it's like, us who? Where? What? Another thing, like, just to give an example of the tonal inconsistencies, towards the end when shit is really hitting the fan and get really dark, they have a character comes and says something like, things are getting bad. And then in the narration it says, no shit, Sherlock. Like, a character doesn't say that. The disembodied book narrator says that. In the middle of this, like, horrible scene, I'm just like, oh, no shit, Sherlock. Like, I'm just not quite sure what was happening here. Also, the characters are very weak in my opinion, to the point where, like, when really, really horrible things start happening to them, I didn't care. I could make an entire standalone review of this because I have a lot of feelings about it. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. I'm very hesitant to make standalone reviews. First of all, because it sounds like a lot of work and I'm lazy, but also because, like, in this case, it would be largely a negative review, and I don't want to come off like I'm calling people stupid. Like, if you like this book, that's great for you. I just didn't really, and I feel like sometimes when people see negative reviews of things they like, they take it as a personal attack, and I'm not here to attack anybody. So, yeah, I don't know. Is this something you'd be interested in? My sort of diagnosis of where this book went wrong? Let me know. So yeah, that's my very scary October wrap-up. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Bye. See you later. Adios. Ciao. Wow, I'm a mess right now. A mess. My hair smells like a fire for some reason. It is a graphic novel about a care of pids.